Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of Beyond the Cage. I am your host, Jim Gramm, going live here on Facebook on the MMA Warriors Facebook page. For those of you who have watched the show before on MMA Warriors, thank you for tuning in once again. And for those of you who are new to the program, thank you for joining for the first time. My show is Beyond the Cage. You can follow me on Facebook as well, like Beyond the Cage, facebook.com/Beyond the Cage podcast. And we also put all of our content back on YouTube, youtube.com/Beyond the Cage podcast. And we also stream on iTunes and Google Play for the audio version of the podcast as well. On today's show, I'm going to go over UFC 211, recap that event a little bit. Also Bellator 179. I'm also going to go into UFC Fight Night 109, which is this weekend from Sweden on Fox Sports 1, as Alexander Gustafson will take on Glover Teixeira at 205 pounds in the 5-round main event. If you ever have any questions or comments, please put them on there, and I'll try to answer them as the broadcast moves along. So thank you for that. Once again, my name is Jim Gramm, and you can follow me on Twitter at Jim Gramm. I'm also on Instagram at the Jim Gramm. Now, let's get into UFC 211. And looking at UFC 211, of course, that was a few weeks ago, but I'm getting it to it now, as some listeners may be able to tell I'm a little bit under the weather, still under the weather. That's why I haven't done my show in a few weeks, for those of you that keeps up with everything. But before I get to the main card, looking over the undercard real quick, some really good performances overall. Gazmirad Antuglov, if I said that name correctly, in the light heavyweight division. First fight of the night, had a very impressive performance, getting a submission victory via rear naked choke, just 2:21 into round number 1, taking out Joaquin Christensen. Was very impressed for that performance. Also, a solid fight by Enrique Barzola against Gabriel Benitez. Barzola was able to get that victory via unanimous decision. And then what I would consider probably of the main card as far as unexpectedness, what a performance by Courtney Casey over Jessica Aguilar. Courtney Casey, a girl not ranked in the top 15 in the women's strawweight division, taking on the former World Series of Fighting champion Jessica Aguilar, who definitely is top 15, not just in the UFC, but in the world at this weight class. And though Aguilar was coming in off about a year layoff from her first UFC fight, which was a loss to Claudia Gadelha, which coincidentally was the last opponent that Courtney Casey fought. Actually, it was a 2-year layoff for Aguilar. And Courtney Casey, one thing about her, she's always ready to fight. And she was definitely a very game opponent against Jessica Aguilar. And really, the big thing about her, she doesn't stop moving. She doesn't stop doing some sort of action. And that was huge in this fight, because she got taken down several times, but man, she was throwing some nasty up kicks. In fact, I don't think I've seen anybody attack with up kicks like that before, at least in the UFC. Maybe in some other organizations or lower level promotions, but to see up kicks like that in the UFC was crazy. And it was definitely a very good performance by Courtney Casey. Definitely shoots her up the rankings. And for Aguilar, obviously another loss in the UFC. This was a layoff. She probably had some rust. Probably will get another fight in the UFC, but this is a case for her where if she doesn't win her next fight, she's probably, 1, going to get cut, and 2, she might have to drop down to 105. She is not a very big strawweight, and even though dropping down to 105 would take her out of the UFC, I think it would be better for her career. She can move to Invicta, still have a successful career, but I think if she wants a little more longevity in her career, I think moving down to 105 is going to be the case, because Courtney Casey is one of the bigger girls in this division, and you could see the size difference between the two during that matchup. And, you know, no offense to Courtney Casey, but she wasn't in the top 15 in the division, so if she lost to her, how's she going to fare against some of these other girls? You know, obviously the two top girls at the division fought that night, UFC 211 and Joanna Andrade. You know, how would they fare against Aguilar? You got to admit, very well, and probably would finish her rather quickly. So I think for Aguilar, that's something she's going to have to consider if she wants to continue fighting at a high level, because she's already in her mid-30s. She doesn't have that much longer of her career as it is anyway, especially after having this 2-year layoff. So that's something she's going to have to consider looking forward, not just for her next fight, but for the rest of her career. Also on the undercard, boy, what a fight between Jason Knight and Chaz Skelly. These two back and forth. Jason Knight always in a great fight, and Jason Knight was able to win via knockout. Incredible performance by the Mississippi native. I believe this is now his third or fourth win in a row in the octagon. I'm going to double check that figure right now. But just a great performance. I mean, stopping the takedown obviously was going to be the key for Knight, taking on a very accomplished wrestler in Chaz Skelly. Shut him down pretty much all night, stopped 5 of 6 takedowns, even got 2 of his own, was 2 for 2. And when it came to the feet, I had a feeling Knight would be able to get the better of Skelly, and that he did, looking over the numbers, as he outstruck Skelly in terms of landed strikes, 65-37, and just was throwing at a much higher pace, too, through 116 strikes to just 71 for Skelly. Kid overall in his career, 20-2. Besides losing his UFC debut, which was on short notice against a legend in Tatsu Kawajiri, he has now won 4 straight, beating some credible guys too. I mean, Dan Hooker, Alex Caceres, and now defeating Chaz Skelly. 3 of those 4 fights have been a performance of the night bonus or some type of post-night bonus for him. The only fight that wasn't was the win there over Dan Hooker. So, he called out that he wants to fight, relatively quickly, and it's hard not to like a guy like this. It really is. A guy that is not only exciting, but is also very talented and is just down to fight and make it entertaining for us, the fans. And so you really got to like a guy like Jason Knight. Also, speaking of performance bonuses, one of the other bonuses on this undercard for UFC 211 went to Chase Sherman, as he had an incredible war there with Rashad Coulter. He took this fight on short notice. It looked as though Sherman had this fight in the bag. Coulter was starting to look really hurt and gassed, but that Coulter started to come back, and he was tagging Sherman, and then finally Sherman landed a huge elbow on the inside to end this one in the second round at 3:36 to get the victory, and did get the fight of the night performance. And awesome victory there by Chase Sherman, and definitely a young heavyweight to look forward to in this division. James Vick, another fantastic performance and another knockout, taking out Polo Reyes with another first-round KO at 2:39 in the first round. And I believe Vick is on quite a winning streak now. That's now 2 in a row for Vick. And since joining the UFC in August of 2013, he has won 7 of his 8 fights, his only loss coming to Beneil Dariush. No shame in that, with Dariush being a top 15 guy the last couple of years. So for James Vick, that's probably what he's going to get. Somebody in that realm of the lower end of the top 15. I would imagine once again after another knockout performance victory there. And then unfortunately on the undercard, the big highlight fight, Eddie Alvarez against Dustin Poirier, what was turning out to be a very good scrap, ended up going down as a no contest, as Eddie Alvarez hit Dustin Poirier with a illegal knee, and with that coming through the second round and it being not intentional, ended up going down as a no contest. And that's one of the things that sucks about this event, was the fact that the Texas Athletic Commission has not adopted the new rules of mixed martial arts, which allows competitors to knee an opponent with only one hand down. And that was a big deal, because if it was under the new rules, those knees would have been legal. But however, Texas is still under the old rules, so they're not. And it's rather unfortunate because this was turning out to be a good scrap, and obviously Eddie was very apologetic after the fight. Even Dustin Poirier stood up for Eddie Alvarez, saying, "Hey, don't boo this man. We're out here fighting, and he's a good guy," and stuff like that. So I would imagine that this fight gets run back at some point. I think that's what I want to see personally, and I really think for both guys is a fight that benefits them to actually see a winner of. So I would hope this one can get run back here pretty quickly, because it was shaping up to be a really good one. And at that point, Eddie Alvarez had definitely started to turn the tables in favor of himself, whereas it looked like Poirier probably had won the first round, at least in my opinion. So definitely a scrap I would be look forward to seeing sometime in the near future. Getting to the pay-per-view main card, looking at David Branch against Christoph Jaco in the middleweight division, first fight of the pay-per-view card. not a very great fight. Probably, I think you can make a case the worst fight of the night overall. David Branch, a guy who had been in the UFC quite a few years ago, went to several different organizations, including Titan and World Series of Fighting. I believe, had won his last 10 fights in a row, including winning the World Series of Fighting middleweight and light heavyweight titles to go along with being a Renzo Gracie black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Definitely a guy that has looked like he's grown since his last forte into the octagon, which was all the way back in 2011 was the last time he had fought, and that was a loss to Husamar Polares. Ended up going 2-2 when he fought in the UFC, with wins over Thomas DeWall and Rich Antonio. Losses coming to the aforementioned Polares as well as Gerald Harris. So definitely a guy looking for some redemption here, taking on Jaco, who was one of the up-and-coming guys in this division at 185 pounds, a young man who up until this point had won 5 consecutive fights, had beat some tough guys like Tammy McCrory and Talas Leites heading into this fight, including a performance of the night bonus knockout win over McCrory back at UFC Fight Night, MacDonald versus Thompson in June of last year, and a guy that had just taken out a very accomplished Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. So it was going to be an interesting fight, but it just didn't turn out that way. The stand-up advantage I thought Jaco would have, he didn't really press the issue, didn't really force the issue, and I was expecting a lot more from Jaco on the feet. I don't know if he was that worried about the takedown from Branch that held him back, but definitely did not pull the trigger a lot. And for Branch, yeah, he tried to take Jaco down. It wasn't completely not trying to take him down, but I mean, he tried 7 times, was only successful on 2 of those attempts. And really, I think the big story of this fight was when Branch couldn't get the clinch, he was still able to control, or wasn't able to get the takedown, I should say, was still able to control Lant in the clinch. You saw Jaco throw his hands up like, oh, come on, what he's doing to the referee, which a couple of times did work for referee Don Turnage to separate the two to go back to standing and at range. And when it was, Jaco didn't take advantage of that. I mean, landing 49 strikes out of 110 thrown in a 50-minute fight's just not going to get it done. And for Branch's credit, you know, he threw 181 and landed 93. Nothing of those were super significant, but he was landing more, he was throwing more, and he was trying for takedowns. And it's just the fact that Branch, you know, he's not a very big power guy, you know, and when he got the fight to the ground, really wasn't able to do much with that position in terms of damage and submission, but he did enough to control the fight to get the win. And definitely, if either guy wants to fight at the elite, they're going to have to really step up their game, because this was not a great performance by either. The next fight of the evening, that was in the featherweight division, as former lightweight champion Frankie Edgar took on up-and-coming Yair Rodriguez. And this fight went just about how I expected it. While Yair Rodriguez is a very dynamic striker, very exciting, throws a lot of crazy kicks, is very fast, he wasn't ready for a wrestler like Frankie Edgar, not quite yet. And it definitely showed. Edgar, even though officially only 1 for 3 on takedowns, was able to get the fight to the ground in both rounds, hold position there, and just unload on the Mexican. I mean, 96 strikes to just 29 landed in favor of Edgar. Edgar threw 130 to just 57 for Yair. I mean, Yair was trying. You know, he tried to get up, but just, you know, Frankie Edgar has such a good top game. Training, he's a Renzo Gracie black belt now. Also with Ricardo Almeida. I mean, he has so many jiu-jitsu background. People don't think of him that way, but he's very good at those positions and very hard to get out from under. So did not surprise me at all. And for Yair, it's definitely a learning experience. It shows that there are still holes in his game, and you know, in a few years maybe he'll be able to correct those and take out somebody the caliber of a Frankie Edgar. But right now, not quite ready. And for Frankie, he's in a very interesting position because he's already fought Jose Aldo twice and has lost twice, and both times Jose Aldo definitely won. There wasn't that much controversy in those decisions. Now, Max Holloway obviously is taking on Jose Aldo coming up here in a few weeks. For Frankie, he really has to hope Max Holloway wins that fight. Because if Max Holloway wins, you can make a case Frankie Edgar to get his 3rd shot at a featherweight title. I know the one was technically an interim, but 3rd shot at capturing some sort of featherweight championship. So for him, he's got to be rooting for Max Holloway, because if Aldo wins again, I don't know how likely the UFC's going to book Aldo Edgar 3, considering the first two matchups. I mean, they weren't bad fights, but they weren't really great fights. And Frankie Edgar and Jose Aldo, I wouldn't say are huge pay-per-view draws at this point in their careers. So I think that's interesting. That's a very interesting situation, and then that forces Frankie to maybe take another fight, because we just saw Aldo Frankie 2 not too long ago. That would have been, I think, about a year ago, or it'll be a little over a year if they fought later this year. So I don't know how hyped fans would be. I certainly wouldn't be very hyped about that matchup, but yeah, it's definitely interesting to see what the UFC will do with Frankie Edgar moving forward. And nothing will happen, of course, until Holloway does fight Aldo here in a couple of weeks. Demian Maia against Jorge Masvidal. A very close fight, very deserving of the split decision. It was really the difference between the control of Demian Maia and the damage landed by Jorge Masvidal. He definitely was landing the harder strikes of the two. Looking at the first round, it was very close because Masvidal had that backpack. He had 3 takedowns, close to getting a submission. Right there towards the end, Masvidal shakes him off, was able to land some very nasty blows to end the round. So that one kind of looks like it could have went either way. The second round definitely was Jorge Masvidal. Outstruck him 15-12, which sure may not sound like a huge disparity, but Maia was 0 for 6 on takedowns. The only round he did not secure a takedown. That round I gave to Maia. And once again, round 3, very close. Maia did get a takedown, did land some ground and pound control about half, maybe a little over half the round, but when it was on the feet, Masvidal was definitely getting the better of those exchanges, and hurt him a couple times there. So it was a very close fight, a fight that I wish could have been a 5-round fight. I think we probably would have got a finish one way or the other with the 5 rounds, but was a 3-round fight, went to split decision. I don't really disagree with the judges because Maia did control a lot of this fight, and even though Masvidal had some chances to end this fight, it wasn't for as much time, or he wasn't doing as much damage for a longer time as opposed to Maia controlling the fight. And definitely a very interesting fight, and for me, even though he lost, I really gained a lot of respect for Jorge Masvidal. I really thought that he didn't have any chance to stop Maia from taking him down and submitting him relatively easily, much like he did Carlos Condit over a year ago. And for Masvidal to go in there against a guy that used to be a middleweight, Masvidal used to be a lightweight, I thought performed very well. And Masvidal, even though he lost, to me earns a lot of respect and still only maybe one fight away from a title shot because of that performance, because the UFC realized how close that fight was. So even with the loss, Masvidal is still in a very good position in this welterweight division, and I'm ready to declare him not just a fluke with his couple of welterweight victories. He's definitely a force to be reckoned with here in this division, and I think he proved it even in a loss at UFC 211. Co-main event of the evening, Jessica Andrade took on Joanna Jędrzejczyk for the strawweight championship, and this was a complete wipeout. I mean, she's had some dominant performances in her title defenses, but you add in arguably the best girl she's ever fought, you add that into the mix, and you get yourselves an incredible championship performance against the girl who was the clear number 1 contender, and she just wiped her out. I mean, 230 land strikes to just 94 for Andrade. Total strikes thrown, 357 to 230 for Andrade. That's 127 more strikes thrown. Then you figure, oh, maybe if Andrade gets it to the ground, right? Only successful on 2 of her 10 takedowns. Stopped 8 of them, did Joanna. And those 2 came very early on in the fight, in the first and second round, where if Andrade was going to get Joanna, in my opinion, she had to get her early in those first 2 rounds, because if winning the championship rounds, I don't think she would be able to keep up with her. And that really what was the case. The speed, the height and reach that Joanna has, and just overall striking technique is second to none in any weight class, male or female, and just a very dominant performance over a really tough girl in Jessica Andrade, who, it's crazy to think, even though she got dominant in a fight and got hit a lot, still kept on coming forward. She was the one kind of chasing Joanna, but she just had no answer for those kicks. Couldn't land an overhand, couldn't do any sort of transition to scramble to get the fight to the ground. It just, whatever Joanna wanted to do in that fight, she got to do, and just absolutely incredible. She's now one fight away from tying Ronda Rousey for most women's title defenses with 6. She currently has 5. I would imagine, as of right now, probably Rose Namajunas would be the most likely candidate to get a shot at Joanna. Unless they want to wait, I'm not really sure who else would be. Obviously, she's already beat Claudia twice. She already beat Carolina. She beat Jessica Penne. Carla Esparza, is not wearing any clothes. So I would say Rose might be the next best candidate. However, we'll see how that goes. Nothing's been announced yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if that what ends up being next for Rose. And Joanna has even said that she thinks Rose is going to be a future champion for this division, just not right now. It's my time. So that's obviously a fight that she would like, and I think with Rose, her submission skills, her scrambling skills, toughness, and obviously is a solid striker in her own right and a big girl for this division too, would be an interesting matchup for Joanna, and would be somewhat of a draw because Rose does have some notoriety and hype behind her as well. So we'll see if that is next for Joanna Champion. Getting to the main event of the evening, Stipe Miocic against Junior Dos Santos, kind of went how I thought it was going to. Junior Dos Santos on this stage of his career, he just can't take the hits like he did. I think those 2 fights against Cain Velasquez, he's definitely looked like a different man in those last 4 fights. Fights. Shots that he had normally been able to take, he just doesn't take as well. And, even though he had a win over Stipe in that time after the 2 Velasquez fights, you could just tell that he's a different man. And, he had his first knockout loss there against Overeem back in December 2015. Hadn't fought in a year. He's already older. Taking the hits. And Stipe was the guy on the really big roll. I just had a feeling that if Stipe was able to land a couple of solid shots early, that Junior wouldn't be able to recover, and that's exactly what happened. And even though Junior showed a new wrinkle to his game, landing some very nice leg kicks, I mean, that wasn't going to stop the fight there in the first round. That wasn't going to win you the fight, or finish the fight, I should say. And for Stipe, he definitely is a guy that has a chance to be the greatest heavyweight of all time now. I mean, he's already defended his title twice. I think one more might give him the all-time heavyweight record. So this is, he's a guy that kind of went from, a meteoric rise, as Mike Goldberg used to say on the UFC broadcast, and it definitely has been that for the Cleveland, Ohio native in Stipe Miocic. And what's next for him? Probably Cain Velasquez, possibly the winner of Verdum and Overeem as they look to complete their trilogy. Francis Ngannou's a name out there. Obviously, Derek Lewis has a fight against Mark Hunt. If Lewis gets by Mark Hunt, he's a guy that kind of shoots up the rankings. But I think I would like to see him against Cain. I think that would be a tremendous fight because both have very heavy hands. Both are great wrestlers. Both can fight at a very high pace. Both have great conditioning. The only difference, Stipe being a little taller and a little longer. I don't know. I think that'd be a very intriguing fight, and I know Cain's been hurt and this and that, but I think that's a good fight to mix. And as far as top heavyweights, he has not faced that one yet. I mean, he's faced Verdum, he's faced Overeem, he's faced Dos Santos, and he's faced Mark Hunt, and he's beaten all those guys. The Cain Velasquez is the only real top heavyweight he hasn't fought yet. So I would look for that fight coming up next. Now, of course, with Cain being injury-prone, he probably could get hurt. Someone else will fill in, but I think that's the fight to make next, Cain Velasquez against Stipe Miocic. Let's get to Bellator 179 a bit here before I get to this weekend's UFC action. Ended up being a 5-fight main card despite Michael Venom Page not being able to compete on the card. Kicked off with Baby Slice, also known as Kevin Ferguson Jr., son of Kimbo Slice. He was able to win his first ever fight against DJ Griffin. It was a catchweight at 165, won by first-round knockout. And it's funny because they said on the broadcast, Jimmy Swift was saying, Baby Slice is saying he doesn't quite have the power that his father does, but I don't know. It looked like he had some incredible power. I mean, he was definitely throwing some hard shots. towards Griffin, and Griffin very early and often was feeling that power, and with those continued following up shots, wasn't able to really do much to baby slice. Was able to land a left. That's what sent Griffin crashing to the canvas, and he was able to follow up with a nasty ground and pound, and that's what got the stoppage there at 3:40 in the first round. And second fight for Ferguson as far as a pro, and second fight under Bellator, looked very good this time around, and definitely a guy that has a lot of potential. Obviously, he's a very young guy. I believe he's only 19, 20 years old, so definitely has a lot of potential moving forward. And obviously, with the name cachet being Kimbo Slice's son, doesn't hurt either. But definitely a guy I'm looking forward to seeing inside the Bellator cage. Alex Lahore against Dan Edwards ended up being a victory for Lahore. Was able to get a knockout, very nice knockout, and a monstrous right hand is what did Edwards in. And followed up with two more huge opponents. You saw him kind of go out there. Great stoppage for Lahore, guy against Dan Edwards. Not a lot of people were talking about this fight. No one even knew probably was going to be on the card. Gets on there, and a nice win for Lahore here in the welterweight division. And that's kind of the types of things that get you noticed, especially with the organization like Bellator in the welterweight division, one of their better divisions. That was a very nice performance on a very big card there over in London. Czech Kongo ended up taking on Augusto Sakai at heavyweight. Not a very great fight. Kongo did what Kongo does. He likes to stall up against in the clinch. Got a few takedowns. Didn't really do much. Sakai, he really wasn't doing much either. All in all, just not a very good fight. Czech Kongo gets the win, and yeah, I don't know. I know Kongo wants to talk about fighting for the new Bellator heavyweight championship, but fights like this, don't get you that sort of spot. And I know Kongo's towards the end of his career. Doesn't want to throw as hard and bang kind of like he used to, but doing stuff like this though don't do you any favors with the fans, and doesn't do any favors with the organization. I can tell you that much. And if he wants a chance to fight somebody like a Fedor, to step up his game, because no one wants to see this. That's for sure. Liam McGarry against Lyndon Vassell. Boy, I thought this was a pretty big upset here for Lyndon Vassell defeating Liam McGarry. I had a feeling this fight could go this way. If Vassell got the fight to the ground, he might be able to control McGarry, who does have some good submissions, does have a good bottom game. Obviously, that length can cause a lot of problems for people. But just overall, I think, like they said on the broadcast, he relies too many on Hail Mary, kind of just throwing up some crazy stuff and hope it lands. And in the past, he's been very successful with it. And so he hasn't really changed that part of his game. But you can tell against guys that have good top games and good takedowns, that's a hole, because he's not really trying to stop you from taking down because he feels so confident he can get a submission off his back. But then when he doesn't get it, he has nothing there. He has no big tangible skills to get the fight back up to the feet, where he is a tremendous striker. So he's going to have to figure something out, whether it's improve his takedown defense, or if the fight gets to the ground, really work hard to scramble and get back up, because these last two fights have shown he doesn't have that in his repertoire, and that's a huge hole if he can't throw up a Hail Mary submission. And sure, those can happen. He's proved it. He's done it a few times, but you can't rely on that in every single fight, that you're going to land that crazy submission that's going to get you the victory, or the crazy submission that will get you a sweep and back up to your feet. You can't always rely on that. And he's going to have to really go back to the drawing board and take that seriously. He's going to really have to take getting back up to his feet or stopping the takedown initially to become a champion to him. Because if you look at guys like a Lyndon Vassell, who obviously just dominated him and then submitted him, Phil Davis and Ryan Bader, those are all guys who are power wrestlers with great takedowns and great top games. And if you want to get by those guys, you're going to have to stop the takedown or get back up quickly if you want to beat them. And right now, he's not showing those skills. And yeah, he's a fantastic striker. Yeah, he can submit a lot of guys in his division. Yeah, he causes problems being 6'6". But at the end of the day, yeah, that hole in the game almost takes away from how good he is at other aspects. And he's really going to have to fix that if he wants to get back to the top again. And that's going to take some serious focus and dedication. And he's going to have to shrug off this notion that he can just submit everybody. You got to have a plan B. Because right now his plan A hasn't been working for him in the last couple of fights. Main event of the evening, Rory MacDonald against Paul Daley. Yeah, I think it was apparent that Rory MacDonald was going to do the smart thing in the path of least resistance and try to get this fight to the ground and take Daley out of his striking game, and he did that great. Rory MacDonald really not known for, wrestling or submissions, I would say. In my opinion, he's known as being a very technical striker, but took the fight to the ground, got it there, and, Paul Daley wasn't able to really do anything against it. And, after the fight, here's the thing about after the fight. Is Paul Daley against MVP a great fight? Yes, no doubt in my mind. I do want to see that fight. But you just lost, and you lost relatively bad. You had a horrible performance against Rory MacDonald. You shouldn't be calling out anybody. I don't care who you're calling out, whether it actually is a great fight. But to call, out MVP, calling him all these names and stuff, like, dude, you just got whooped by Rory MacDonald. Like, you're worried now. You're all of a sudden worried about your next fight. You're worried about MVP. Like, why don't you worry about how to get better at the ground, dude? Because you just got whooped by Rory MacDonald. I mean, I know that's a huge shame. Rory MacDonald's a great fighter and all, but it's like you don't have any, like, I don't know. I just didn't like it. If you go out there, you beat Rory MacDonald, call out whoever the heck you want. You deserved it. You earned that right. You beat a top 5 guy at 170 pounds, but you just lost to him in bad fashion, getting submitted in the second round, and then you're going to call somebody else out? Get out of here, dude. For real. Just get out of here. All right, let's get to UFC Fight Night 109 coming up this Sunday, so be advised for that. Sunday on Fox Sports 1, May 28th. That is Memorial Day weekend here in the United States, so thus the switch to Sunday. 12 fights overall for the card coming from, I believe it is Stockholm, Sweden, at the Ericsson Globe Arena. Looking at the main card, we're going to have 6 fights on the card, on the main card, and 6 fights on the prelims. Looking over the prelims, probably looking at the Trevor Smith-Chris Camozzi fight. I think that's going to be a very solid fight there. That's going to be on the FS1 portion of the prelims, and also on the Fight Pass, Demir Hazovic, if I said that correctly, from Bosnia. He's taking on Masin Held at 155 pounds. I also think that is a matchup to look out for as well. Kicking off the main card is going to be Jack Hermanson against Alex Nicholson. This should be a very interesting matchup. Alex Nicholson is a very hard-hitting middleweight guy, very long and lanky for this weight class. I believe he's listed at 6'5", if I am not mistaken. Pulling up his information right now. And guy that kind of burst onto the scene here in the UFC, winning a couple fights, then had a setback and lost to Sam Alvey in fall of last year. That was in Mexico City, and I believe has won a fight since then. Overall, his record is 7-3 to Hermanson's 14-3, and Hermanson will be the hometown guy there, fighting in front of his home country in Sweden. And I really think the interesting part of this fight will be the ground game, because I would consider both guys more of a striker, and the ground game, we really haven't seen Nicholson do too much in that aspect. So I am looking forward to see how the ground game will go between these two guys, and I really think that's the difference, is how the ground game will go, because I think the striking will be relatively even, considering both guys are going to be really tall for this weight class, and I think the advantage that Nicholson has over most guys is a little bit negated in this one. And looking at his last couple of fights, it was a win for Nicholson in his last fight in the UFC, and that was actually his last fight was the loss to Sam Alvey. Okay, I thought he had fought since then, but has not. So it's been a little bit of a layoff there for Nicholson, and as I mentioned, taking on Jack Hermanson, 14-3 overall. Of his 14 victories, has 8 knockouts. He lost his last fight to Cesar Fajeda by triangle choke, but obviously Nicholson doesn't have quite the submission game that Cesar Fajeda has. Before that, did win his only other UFC fight, as he was able to defeat Scott Askham. So I think this is going to be a solid fight, a really good fight to open the card. These two guys between them have 14 knockout victories. I'm looking forward to it. I think it's kind of an under-the-radar fight, and to me it's kind of a dark horse for Fight of the Night as well. Looking at Enkamp versus Talib, that's the next fight here at 170 pounds. Looking at Oliver Enkamp, he is undefeated in his career at 7-0, fighting in his home country of Sweden, taking on Nordin Talib from France, 11-4. He's fought a couple of times in the UFC, bringing up his numbers here. And Talib definitely obviously has the more experience, not just in fights, but just fighting in the UFC for several times. 6 of his 12 wins by knockout, the other 6 by decision. He's fought some tough guys since coming into the UFC back in April of 2014. Overall 4-2 in the organization. Does have a win over Jianglin Li, Chris Clements, and then most recently had a loss in a very good fight against Santiago Ponzinibbio back in February of this year. And also his biggest victory today, probably defeating Eric Silva, knocking out the Brazilian at UFC 196. For Enkamp, more of a submission guy. 4 of his 7 career victories are by submission, and he will be making his UFC debut. Only has 1 knockout to his credit, and that actually came in his last fight, which was just April of this year, back for Superior Challenge 15, which is an organization out of Sweden. So, interesting. Talib is a very well-rounded guy, very strong for this weight class, hard guy to take down. And Enkamp, he's might be in for some trouble here. I would consider Talib to be the better striker. If this fight goes to the ground, it might favor Enkamp a little bit more. But you also got to add in octagon jitters. And even though people say, "Oh, I feel more comfortable at home. You don't have to travel and stuff like that," sometimes that can be a lot of pressure to be fighting in front of your friends and family, let alone it also being your UFC debut for the first time, and that can get on a young kid. And a veteran like Talib might not let that bother him as much fighting in enemy territory. Now this being his 7th UFC fight, so I would favor a little bit Talib in this matchup. Next fight of the evening, Abdul Razak Al Hassan will take on Omari Akhmedov. This is going to be in the welterweight division. Al Hassan coming out of Ghana, he's 7-0 against the Russian native, who is 16-3. And looking at Al Hassan, like I said, the young man coming out of Ghana, all 7 wins by knockout, is 1-0 in the UFC as he knocked out Charlie Ward in just 53 seconds. And in fact, the longest he has ever fought for was 1:26 in the first round. He has breezed through everybody he has fought. He has actually fought for Bellator twice. He's fought for Rage in the Cage. He's fought for Legacy. So he's fought for some very quality organizations, and has just breezed through everybody. And very excited to see how this guy fares in the UFC. I mean, having not fought longer than 1:26 is awfully impressive. But he's taken on a guy that not only trains with the American Top Team, is a very good Sambo guy, and is a very big guy for this weight class, standing at 6 foot tall. A guy that is most recently coming off a good victory over Kyle Noak in his last fight, also owns a victory over Brian Ebersol. So far in the UFC has a record of 4-3, but like I said, he's been taking on tough guys. I mean, he's fought Gunnar Nelson, he fought Brian Ebersol, he fought Sergio Moraes. Like I said, most recently fought Kyle Noak. And definitely is a guy, definitely more of a decision-prone guy. 4 decision victories. Does have 12 finishes of his own, but so far in the UFC has gone to the scorecards a few times. Does have some finishes as well. So really, I think it's going to be the striking of Al Hassan against the grappling and Sambo background of Akhmedov. And the big thing is going to be the condition, because if Al Hassan can't get this fight out of the first round, what is his conditioning like? He's never had to go past 1:26 into the first round. So I think that is a very big deal against the guy that I would consider a more well-rounded skill set, just because we've seen more tape of him. If you haven't had to go longer than 1:26, you really haven't had to show your skills. So he might be a fantastic grappler. He might be great at takedowns. We don't know. But when you're knocking dudes out in less than 90 seconds, you don't need to show those skills. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out for Al Hassan, but definitely a guy that could have a potential to be a breakout star. Next fight of the evening will also be at 170 pounds as Ben Killaby Saunders will take on Peter Sebata. Saunders has looked pretty well since coming back to the UFC last year. I believe his last fight was against Court McGee, if I am not mistaken, and it was a fight that, even though he won by unanimous decision, I think a lot of people, and I think myself included, thought Court McGee did enough to get the victory. And even after the fight, Ben Saunders said that he wasn't really that satisfied with his performance. He returned to the UFC back in 2014. Has so far won 5 of 6 fights, the only loss coming to Patrick Cote. Obviously known for his submission skills, 7 of 21 victories by submission. Has the only omoplata submission victory in UFC history. As far as losses go, has been knocked out a couple times, never submitted, only 3 decisions. Peter Sebata, solid stand-up, but he's known for his submission well. He has 10 of 16 victories by submission. So far since rejoining the UFC, this is his second stint in the organization. He is now 3-1, the lone loss coming to Kyle Noak. He most recently defeated Nicholas Dalby. That was back in September of 2016 at Fight Night 93. I think if it stays standing, I think you got to give an edge to Ben Saunders. He's going to have a little longer reach and a little bit of a height. Even though Sebata is a big welterweight at 6 foot, Saunders is even bigger at 6'3". And grappling-wise, I think they're pretty even, but I think that long frame and the rubber guard, I would give an advantage to Ben Saunders. But I think if you're Sebata, it goes a little more into a 50-50 fight, and Ben Saunders has been controlled by wrestlers before in the past, despite the frame and the submission skills. So I think that's where you go if you're Sebata, because I think standing at range, I think you play more into Saunders' hands. But going inside the clinch, making it dirty, making it ugly, making Saunders work for those positions to either pull guard or make them separate to get in the feet, I think is a very big key for Sebata. Striking on the inside, I think, would be the key here for Peter. He can do those things, he can get a victory, but if he allows Ben Saunders to really dictate the pace, dictate the range, really get into those rubber guard, mission control positions very easily, control the pace on the ground, even off his back, he could be in some trouble. Absolutely. Co-main event of the evening, Vladimir Ozdemir against Misha Krunkanov, and those names are familiar to her. That's kind of what the light heavyweight division is right now. Believe it or not, this is a matchup of 2 top 10 light heavyweights between the Latvian native Krunkanov and the Swiss native in Ozdemir. Looking at Krunkanov, he came off a very big victory in his last fight as he was able to defeat Nikita Krylov back at UFC 206. So far, 4-0 in the UFC, all victories by finish, 3 submissions and 1 knockout. He has looked nothing short of fantastic in that last fight, a fight that I would have gave the advantage to Krylov to. Boy, he really impressed me and beat a very tough guy in Nikita Krylov. And for Ozdemir, he's a guy that kind of came out of nowhere to defeat Ovince St. Preux via split decision earlier this year. And with that victory, that propelled him into the top 10 rankings. I don't think just one win in the UFC should get him that high in the rankings. So in that fight, it was a close fight against Ovince. He did get the win, but Krunkanov, man, I think he's the better fighter. I think he has the better submission game. I think he hits harder. He's fought the tougher guys. And while Ozdemir get the victory, he took a lot of shots in that matchup against OSP, and maybe we'll see his full potential in this fight because he'll have a full camp to go with this one. But from what I saw in that fight, I wasn't that impressed, even though he did get the victory. He shows that he has a lot of heart, and he's a tough guy to put away. But Krunkanov's put away some tougher guys, I have felt, and I also think is going to be the bigger guy, too. He's definitely a physical specimen. I think right now he's a guy that could very well fight for the title by this time next year. He's that close. I mean, he's already ranked number 7. Win over Ozdemir, he would beat the number 5 guy, and he would have 2 back-to-back top 15 victories. He's definitely a force to be reckoned with, and I just think wherever the fight goes, Ozdemir is going to have a tough time dealing with this big, strong Latvian. Getting to the main event of the evening, Alexander Gustafson against Glover Teixeira. This fight actually was supposed to happen a couple of years ago in Germany. I believe Gustafson pulled out due to injury, ended up later on that year fighting Daniel Cormier for the light heavyweight championship, and since that time losing another championship belt, or bout, I should say. He never had the belt. He was able to come back and dominate against Jan Blachowicz at UFC Fight Night 93. A very uncharacteristic performance of Alexander Gustafsson, as he really just took that fight to the ground, which we really hadn't seen before in his career. And for Glover, since losing his title shot to John Jones, that was a while ago. That was back at UFC 172, so about 3 years ago now. Did have a nice 3-fight winning streak there when he beat OSP, Patrick Cummings, and Rashad Evans. Does have a loss to Phil Davis and Anthony Johnson in there as well. Is coming off a win over Jared Cannonier, which, yeah, he beat Cannonier. It was a dominant performance, but Cannonier is not quite, top 5, top 10 guy yet. Maybe he could be, but I definitely knew that was a fight to get Glover back in the win. And this is the fight I've wanted to see for a while, actually. Glover against Gustafsson. It's crazy that these two have been in the organization. Let's see, for Glover, he's been in the UFC since 2012, and for Gustafsson, he debuted in 2009. And these two have been towards the top end of the lightweight division pretty much since that time, so it's crazy that these two haven't fought each other before. Finally get to see it here. And the winner probably gets a shot at John Jones or Daniel Cormier, whoever comes out of that. And I think that's a good thing. You either set up, and for Gustafsson, he already had 2 great wars with those 2 guys, being Jones and Cormier. So having a rematch against either one of those, I think, would be a fantastic fight. Glover, of course, did not have a great performance against John Jones, but who knows what would happen in a rematch. Probably John Jones will win. However, I think against Cormier, I think he might have a little more of a chance if Cormier comes out of that John Jones matchup the victor. So, and really, there's nothing else in this division for those guys to really fight for, in my opinion. So I would imagine a win by either gets themselves a title shot. And this should be a really good fight. I think the biggest difference is going to be the ground game. Even though Gustafsson showed an improved game, does have some submissions, I don't think he really wants to be on bottom of a very good jiu-jitsu expert in Glover Teixeira. Standing up, I would say Glover is the harder hitter of the two, but Gustafsson, with his lanky frame and striking from the outside, can be the difference. However, as we saw in the DC fight, didn't use his range very well in that fight and allowed a shorter man in DC to come forward and land shots inside the pocket. And if you do that against Glover, I think you have a chance to get knocked out. Glover definitely has tremendous power and also is a very tough guy to finish. He's never been knocked out in his career, and that's a huge thing for a guy that keeps coming forward. You keep tagging him. That's a huge asset to have. Actually, you know what? Anthony Rumble Johnson knocked him out, so he has lost by knockout in his career. But Gustafsson, not quite the power of Rumble Johnson. So this is a very, very intriguing fight. I think if Gustafsson keeps the outside, actually uses his range, I think he can win this fight. But if he allows Glover to get inside, land some big bombs, and even get this fight to the ground, I think it could be Glover. But a very interesting fight. I'm looking forward to, and a fight I've been looking forward to seeing for a long time. So with that said, let me get to picks here for UFC Fight Night 109. First fight of the evening, Alexander Nicholson against Jack Hermanson. I'm going to go with Alexander Nicholson. I like this kid. I've interviewed him on the show before. I think he has a lot of raw power, and I think he's going to be able to take out the Joker in his home country. Olivander Inkamp against Nordib Talin. Really like Talib. I think he's just a well-rounded fighter. He's going to be a little bigger and stronger, and just a veteran of the sport. And I think it's going to be, even though Inkamp is a young kid making his UFC debut, don't have a lot of tape on him. Maybe he can surprise a veteran like Talib, but I'm going to go with the Frenchman and Talib to win this one. Razak Al-Hassan against Omari Akhmedov. I really want to pick Hassan because, 7 fights, 7 first-round finishes, not going longer than 90 seconds, I think is incredible. But Akhmedov is the more well-rounded individual, and I like his Sambo background, so I'm going to go with the Russian to win this one. Peter Sebata against Ben Saunders. Like the height and reach of Ben Saunders, and when it comes to submission-wise, I think Ben Saunders is a very tricky guy to deal with on the ground, even though Sebata has 10 submission victories to his credit. I just think Ben Saunders is a little better in every area, so I'm going to go with Killa B to win this one. Volkan Ozdemir against Misha Krunkanov. Ozdemir showed a lot, again, in his debut against OSP, but Krunkanov right now is on a huge roll. He's a monster in this weight class, a huge dude, can finish anywhere, and I think he's going to be able to get the finish against Ozdemir and move into the top 5 of this division. Alexander Gustafson against Glover Teixeira, number 1 and 2 respectively in the light heavyweight division. I'm going to go with the Mauler, fighting in his home country. He has performed well. I guess he didn't perform well against Rumble Johnson, but other than that, he's done very well fighting in his home country. And I think for Glover, he's a little slower at this stage of his career. I think he's going to have a hard time keeping up with Alexander Gustafson, going to have a hard time getting in range. And I think because of that, Gustafson is going to get the victory and probably have a good 25-minute performance and get the unanimous decision. So that's my picks for UFC Fight Night 109. Thanks for watching here on the MMA Warriors Facebook page. My name is Jim Gramm. You can follow me on Twitter at Jim Gramm. You can like Beyond the Cage on Facebook, facebook.com/Beyond the Cage Podcast. We're also on YouTube, youtube.com/Beyond the Cage Podcast. You can check out past shows, interviews, and good stuff like that. And I'm also on Instagram at @TheJimGramm. And if you want, you can catch the audio version on Google Play and iTunes as well. So thank you to MMA Warriors for hosting me here on Facebook. And once again, I am Jim Gramm, and thank you for joining another edition here of Beyond the Cage.